In the dark of night, King Charles stepped back while William and Catherine were crowned without the world's knowledge. The nation awoke to a new era already in motion. But what drove this sudden transition, and what hidden story lies behind it? Stay with us as we reveal the hidden story behind this unprecedented night. It was a morning that began like countless others at Anmer Hall. The quiet Norfolk estate had long been William and Catherine's retreat from the weight of duty, a place where children's laughter bounced through hallways, and the family could gather around the breakfast table without the interruptions that defined life in London. The scent of toast and eggs hung in the air, mingling with the clinking of cutlery and the kind of light conversation that families cling to in moments of reprieve. Yet beneath this calm, a phone call was waiting to rewrite the rhythm of their day and the course of their lives. The call did not come through the usual household line. It was direct, urgent, and from the palace itself. A voice trained in diplomacy, stripped of all ornament, carried a message that allowed no negotiation. Their presence was required at once. Immediate attendance. The words carried an unshakable gravity, leaving no space for assumption or delay. Even in a family where protocol was part of the air they breathed, this kind of summons was exceptional. Within minutes, the atmosphere at Anmer Hall changed. Children were quietly moved to the care of trusted staff, their day restructured without explanation. Catherine's calm instructions and William's clipped decisiveness created a kind of unspoken harmony, as if both had silently agreed to protect the innocence of their children from the storm beginning to rise. The breakfast table, still set with cups and plates, stood abandoned. The journey from Norfolk to London became a study in silence. Cars moved quickly but discreetly, the routes cleared with precision. Inside, William sat with a gaze fixed outward, his thoughts churning in a private storm. Catherine, composed yet pale, glanced at her husband only once, and the small exchange said more than words could manage. Each of them knew that such a call, framed in such urgent tones, carried the kind of weight that history books would one day record. As the convoy drew closer to Buckingham Palace, subtle signs of heightened security became evident. Gates that usually opened with dignified calm now did so with a kind of controlled haste. Officers at checkpoints offered nods that blended respect with unease. Even in a household where ceremonial formality was the daily script, the pace of the morning carried a sharper, faster beat. What struck William most was not the bustle of staff or the unusual timing, but the stillness within the palace walls as he and Catherine stepped out of the car. Long corridors, normally humming with the shuffle of aides and advisors, seemed hushed. Courtiers moved with deliberate discretion, avoiding eye contact, their faces etched with knowledge they were not permitted to voice. The quiet itself seemed to say, something irreversible had shifted. Guided by a private secretary, William and Catherine were escorted through service passages that bypassed the usual ceremonial routes. The choice of entrance alone spoke volumes. They were not here as the Duke and Duchess seeking an audience. They were being summoned as the future king and queen, and the palace machinery was moving with that awareness. Every step toward the king's chambers echoed with the weight of transition, though no one dared to articulate it aloud. Behind them, Anmer Hall's morning scene remained suspended in time. The plates, the cooling toast, the laughter of children shielded from what their parents were now about to face. That fragile balance between private life and national duty had cracked in a single phone call, leaving no return to what had been only hours before. The gravity of the moment was sharpened by the knowledge that they were not just walking into a family conversation. They were stepping into history's grip. The palace's decision to summon them without delay revealed that something had advanced beyond the ordinary flow of updates and briefings. The king required his heirs at his side immediately, and that urgency was itself a message more powerful than words. What awaited them behind the king's closed door would change their lives forever. But at this moment, only one truth mattered. Duty had arrived unannounced, as it always did, and it had claimed their morning without mercy. What did King Charles have to say that could not wait another day, another hour, another moment? Stay with us to uncover the details. King's Door, King's Burden. The palace is built on traditions that speak louder than announcements, and one of those traditions is the King's Door. Not every family member, not even every senior royal, enters through it. The door is reserved for moments when privacy outweighs ceremony, when words must be exchanged away from the marble halls and polished cameras. For William and Catherine, being guided to this discreet threshold was no small signal. Something more than routine awaited them. The private secretary who escorted them did so with an expression honed by years of service. He said little, but his body language spoke of urgency and discretion. His footsteps echoed against the polished floor in steady rhythm, as if trying to hold together the gravity of the moment with composure alone. William caught the subtle glance of a chamberlain as they passed, a look that conveyed both respect and sorrow. Courtiers were trained to remain unreadable, yet in rare moments the mask cracked. This was one of them. Crossing the king's door was not just an entrance into a private room, it was a crossing into responsibility that could no longer be delayed. William, who had grown up within these very walls, recognized it instantly. This was the door through which his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had conducted statecraft shielded from prying eyes. Now it was the door that separated him and Catherine from a truth the king had chosen to share personally, not through advisors or typed briefings. The study itself carried the weight of history. Dark wood panels framed the walls, and portraits of ancestors gazed down with silent authority. On the desk lay not scattered papers, but an arrangement that suggested preparation. A stack of official documents sat neatly aligned, an ink pen resting across the top, as though the king had paused mid-thought. Every item seemed to have been placed deliberately, perhaps to steady the gravity of the moment with order. Charles was seated, but his posture carried both tension and fatigue. His suit was immaculate, yet his hands betrayed a restless unease as they pressed together, fingertips tapping ever so slightly. When William and Catherine entered, he rose, not with the ceremonial gestures of a monarch, but with the awkward dignity of a father carrying the heaviest of burdens. He extended his hand toward his son, but there was something more personal than formal in the gesture, something that blurred the lines between sovereign and parent. No words were spoken immediately. Instead, there was the quiet of three people standing in a room that seemed suddenly too small for what it had to hold. The secretary retreated, closing the door behind them, leaving only the muffled hush of the palace beyond. The sound of the latch clicking shut underscored the privacy of the moment. This was not for Parliament. This was not for courtiers. This was for them alone. Charles's eyes told the story before his voice did. They carried the exhaustion of treatments, the strain of leading through uncertainty, and the haunting knowledge of time running shorter than expected. Yet there was also a flicker of determination, the same resilience that had marked his decades as heir. He was not a man surrendering his role, but a king preparing to hand over a weight he had carried for too long. William and Catherine stood close, instinctively uniting as they waited for him to speak. The king gestured toward the chairs opposite his desk, inviting them to sit. The act seemed ordinary, yet it marked a threshold. The private study had become a chamber of revelation, and the next words would bind them to responsibilities they could neither refuse nor postpone. This was not an ordinary father's confession to his son. This was a monarch preparing to lift the veil on decisions and realities that would alter not only the family's course, but also the nation's. Every breath in the room seemed to anticipate the weight of the disclosure. What message would King Charles deliver behind that closed door, where only three voices could share the truth? Come with us to find out. The Blue Room Reckoning. In the heart of Buckingham Palace lies a chamber that carries a significance few outsiders know. The Blue Room. While often photographed during state occasions, its more private use is very different. It is here that sensitive meetings unfold, where formality provides cover for truths too heavy to deliver anywhere else. On this particular day, the Blue Room was not a backdrop for ceremony, but a stage for disclosure that would strike with clinical precision. When William and Catherine stepped into the room, they immediately sensed its transformation. The familiar grandeur remained. The deep cobalt silk walls, the ornate gilt frames, the chandelier that caught the early light. But the atmosphere was stripped of pageantry. Instead, it had been rearranged for an audience with science and medicine. Chairs had been drawn into a precise semicircle. A small table stood ready with water glasses untouched. Files, bound in sober blue folders, waited like silent messengers. Three figures rose as the couple entered. They were not courtiers but doctors of the highest standing, an oncologist who had become a leading authority across Europe, a cancer specialist known for pioneering trials, and the chief of palliative care whose name rarely entered the public sphere but whose counsel was often sought in the darkest corridors of hospitals. These were not ordinary physicians. They were the select few entrusted to guide the health of a sovereign. Charles, already seated among them, looked smaller in the company of men and women who carried no titles of nobility, yet held authority that could outweigh crowns. The king's presence signaled acceptance. He was here not as a figure of ceremony, but as a patient whose future rested on charts and scans. The lead oncologist began, not with hesitation, but with clarity. He unfolded the folder, each page marked by graphs, colored scans, and sharp numbers that required no embellishment. Words like stage 4, progression, and limited response punctuated the air. These were not words softened for family ears. They were unfiltered truths delivered because the stakes demanded it. Catherine's hands, clasped in her lap, tightened with each medical term, while William sat forward, his jaw set in the stillness that comes when one listens to an outcome they already fear. The cancer specialist spoke next, outlining treatment options still available but carefully noting their diminishing return. Immunotherapy, radiation cycles, palliative measures. The language was clinical, but the meaning was clear. Medicine could no longer extend years, only months, and the time left required planning beyond the hospital. The doctors did not dwell on metaphors or reassurance. They offered facts, strategies, and timelines. The chief of palliative care closed the briefing. His words were quiet, measured, and precise. He explained not only what could be done for the king's physical comfort, but also how to prepare for transition in leadership without abrupt disruption. It was an unusual role for a doctor, but one that reflected the reality. Charles was not only a patient, he was a monarch whose decline could not be hidden without consequence. The room held its silence once the doctors finished. For William and Catherine, it was not only the content of the meeting, but the formality that weighed heavily. To have such disclosures made in the Blue Room, with documents signed, notes recorded, and advisors witnessing, meant that this was official. It was not a private father-to-son revelation. It was a national reality, now codified in the files before them. William felt the dual pull of son and heir, a split role he had always known would come, but hoped would be years away. Catherine's gaze did not waver from the table, as though reading the maps of numbers and graphs could make them less absolute. For both, the reckoning was no longer distant. It was here, inscribed in charts and spoken in measured tones that left no room for denial. What plans would the king and his heir now be forced to confront once the doctors left and the family remained alone? Stay with us to know what really happened. Contingencies spoken softly. Not every conversation within a royal palace is designed for record. Some are conducted in whispers, spoken only once, and remembered for a lifetime by the few who were present. After the doctors departed, the Blue Room emptied of medical charts and quiet authority, leaving only the king, his son, and his daughter-in-law. The silence that lingered in their absence was different from before, less clinical, more intimate, though no less heavy. Charles adjusted his seat slowly, almost as if shifting from one role into another. A moment earlier he had been a patient receiving instruction. Now he resumed the mantle of sovereign, with words to deliver that no physician could speak for him. William leaned back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed entirely on his father. Catherine, still seated upright, folded her hands in her lap, with a calmness that concealed the storm she felt within. The king's voice, when it came, carried a rawness, absent from his usual measured tone. He began not with medical detail, that had already been addressed, but with acknowledgement. He admitted openly that the doctor's conclusions were in line with his own unspoken suspicions. For weeks he had sensed the pace of his illness quickening, a reality he had chosen to keep shielded until it was confirmed beyond doubt. Now that it was, he could no longer delay. He turned first to William. The words were not rehearsed, nor did they sound ceremonial. He spoke instead of inevitability, the prospect that the throne might pass sooner than anticipated. He emphasized the need for readiness, not only in constitutional matters, but in personal fortitude. "You must be prepared," he said softly, his gaze steady. not simply for the crown, but for the burden that comes with it. It was not a command, nor quite a plea. It was an acknowledgement that William's private timeline had been rewritten. Catherine's name followed next, and here Charles's voice softened further. He expressed gratitude for the steadiness she had provided not only to William but to the monarchy itself. Yet he also revealed his fear that her ongoing treatment, already demanding enough, might collide with the expectation of stepping into the role of queen consort at a pace faster than anyone had imagined. "I worry for the toll it may take," he admitted, "but I trust your strength, as I always have." For Catherine, the words landed with the weight of both recognition and forewarning. The conversation then shifted to matters that could never be spoken in public yet were essential for continuity. Charles outlined discrete plans that had long been drafted but rarely discussed. He mentioned the mechanisms of regency, the safeguarding of constitutional stability, and the delicate balance of public communication. He spoke of council meetings that would need to be convened, oaths to be signed, and the careful choreography that would shield the monarchy from appearing shaken. Each phrase carried centuries of precedent, yet now they were framed in immediate relevance. William asked few questions, his responses measured and deliberate. It was not his instinct to rush into detail, but to absorb, to weigh, to listen. Catherine, though silent, provided an anchor in her presence. She did not interrupt, yet her calm composure made the dialogue possible, allowing father and son to focus on the future rather than stumble into grief. As the conversation unfolded, the king's tone shifted one last time, becoming quieter still. He admitted the difficulty of saying aloud what had remained unspoken, that this exchange might be the closest they would come to a rehearsal for the inevitable. It was not surrender, nor was it resignation. It was a statement of fact, spoken softly, privately, without flourish. In that moment, the monarchy itself seemed condensed into three figures in a room, trading words that balanced between personal farewell and national necessity. Outside, the palace moved on with its daily rhythm. Inside, history was quietly being prepared. What unspoken gestures and private rituals would now follow as the king began his own silent leave-taking from duty? Come with us to see what lies ahead. The silent farewell. There are moments in a monarch's life that are never formally recorded, moments where no camera, no diary, and no public announcement is allowed. This was one of them. Following the private exchange with William and Catherine, King Charles began what could only be described as a farewell, written in silence rather than words. He did not summon great ministers or convene state councils. Instead, he moved through his familiar spaces in the palace with a kind of unhurried purpose, as though tracing his final steps as custodian of a role he had long carried. The corridors chosen were not those of ceremony. He bypassed the great staircases and gilded chambers known to the public. Instead, he walked the quieter passages, those that generations of monarchs had used to move unseen between offices and private quarters. The king's stride was deliberate, not hurried, his hand trailing against the dark wainscoting at times, pausing at familiar door frames as though marking places that had defined his reign in ways invisible to the outside world. First came the diaries. For decades, Charles had maintained meticulous personal notes, accounts of audiences, reflections on statecraft, private sketches of moments he could not share elsewhere. These were not destined for archives yet. They were instead placed in order, page by page, in a locked leather folio. The act was symbolic but deeply intentional, to leave behind a roadmap of thought for the son who would inherit not only a crown but also the unrelenting solitude that accompanied it. Next were the codes. Few know the extent of documents a monarch must safeguard, but Charles had long been keeper of communications both ceremonial and strategic. From state briefings to encrypted protocols that ensured continuity of government, he gathered what could be passed, sealed them in discreet envelopes, and marked them for delivery to William at the appropriate moment. These were not gestures of nostalgia, but of necessity, ensuring that transition would be smooth even if sudden. As he moved from study to library, the king paused before a portrait of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. It was not a staged moment of mourning. It was a silent acknowledgement of continuity. She had once walked these same hidden halls, had once prepared in her own way for the weight she bore. Now, Charles found himself standing in that same shadow, passing it forward. His lips did not move, but his eyes lingered, conveying a private farewell to the woman who had set the standard for his crown. Beyond the walls of the palace, the world remained unaware. Tourists gathered at the gates, guards performed their watch with precision, and staff carried on with daily tasks. Yet those closest to the king noticed subtle changes. His trusted valet received garments folded with unusual care, as though the monarch himself wished to ensure order for the days ahead. Personal staff were thanked with a level of sincerity that hinted at more than routine courtesy. Even in silence, the king was preparing his circle for absence. The family, too, felt the change. That evening, Charles chose to dine in the smaller private dining room rather than the grand hall. The atmosphere was restrained, filled with quiet gestures rather than conversations. At one point, he reached across the table to touch Catherine's hand lightly, a simple sign of affection, of recognition, of trust. William watched the exchange in silence, understanding without words what his father was attempting: to communicate love and legacy in gestures that no public speech could capture. What secret preparations would the palace machinery now set into motion as the midnight hour approached? Let us tell you. Midnight Protocol. When the palace clock struck midnight, its chime carried farther than the corridors. For those within the inner circle, the sound marked the moment when ordinary routine gave way to protocol. It was a transformation invisible to the outside world, yet deeply choreographed behind locked doors. In silence, the machinery of monarchy began to turn toward succession, not in months or weeks, but in hours. The first stirrings came from the Privy Council office. Secure calls were placed, not to the public ministers who filled headlines, but to clerks and officers entrusted with centuries-old responsibilities. Attendance lists were checked and cross-checked, couriers dispatched to ensure that every member who must bear witness to the legal oaths would be available at dawn. It was a process as old as the crown itself, updated only by the presence of encrypted digital confirmations. In another wing of the palace, senior clerks assembled documents prepared long ago for contingencies. Among them was the formal declaration of accession, drafted with care to allow for swift proclamation. Sealed envelopes, marked with the royal cipher, were removed from safes that few had keys to. Though unsigned, they were ready, awaiting the moment when the transfer of authority would no longer be theoretical. At Westminster, the church moved in tandem. The Archbishop of Canterbury had been alerted earlier in the evening, and by midnight he was already arranging to stand ready for what the coming dawn might demand. Robes, liturgies, and ceremonial scripts were laid out, not for grandeur, but for precision. If called upon, his words would need to weave continuity into prayer without revealing haste. Meanwhile, the Lord Chamberlain's department handled the details no proclamation could ignore: security for dawn travel, seating arrangements within the confines of St. James's Palace, and the subtle coordination of uniforms for guards who must strike the balance between solemnity and visibility. Each detail, down to the polishing of insignia, carried purpose. Continuity in image was as vital as continuity in governance. In another office, lawyers of the Crown were summoned. Their task was not to debate policy, but to ensure legal seamlessness. Drafts of oaths were examined line by line. Statutes of the Regency Acts were reread, contingency clauses highlighted in yellow. It was not enough to rely on tradition. The midnight hours required certainty that every signature, every word, would withstand scrutiny centuries later. While this machinery moved, William and Catherine were not at rest. Though they were not yet summoned to sign or stand before council, they were aware of the unfolding tide. Their private quarters within the palace had been quietly prepared for them to remain through the night, and aides discreetly entered with folders marked only for their eyes. These contained outlines of their immediate obligations, addresses to the nation, notes on how to approach foreign heads of state, and even guidelines for attire suitable for a dawn proclamation. The atmosphere was heavy with purpose, yet marked by a striking absence of noise. No footsteps echoed unnecessarily, no conversations carried beyond closed doors. Midnight at the palace had become a symphony of whispers, each department contributing its part to a transition designed never to falter, even under the most sudden of circumstances. What lent these hours their uniqueness was not the visible preparation for coronation, but the invisible discipline of restraint. There would be no trumpet fanfares, no public rehearsals. This was monarchy reduced to its core function, ensuring that when the sovereign could not stand, another was already in place, ready and legitimate, before the sun rose. As the final minutes of midnight passed, the palace held its breath. Documents were stacked neatly, seals pressed into waiting wax, and attendants stood ready with envelopes that could only be opened on command. The night had reshaped itself into a bridge, carrying the kingdom from one reign toward another before dawn's first light. What message would the world awaken to once the palace allowed the silence to break? Come with us to know. Dawn breaks. Nation wakes. The first light of day crept across London, gilding the skyline while the city below stirred in its usual rhythm. Yet behind the palace gates, dawn did not simply signal the start of another morning. It was the moment when carefully guarded silence gave way to public acknowledgement. The night's hidden machinery had done its work. Now came the test of how a nation would be told. Shortly after 6, senior aides gathered in a private chamber adjacent to the palace press office. Drafts of the official statement were laid on a polished oak table. Each word had been weighed and reweighed through the night, ensuring the tone conveyed both dignity and stability. The first line carried the solemn announcement of the king's condition, followed swiftly by language that underlined continuity. It was designed not only to inform but also to steady. At the same time, communication officers liaised with broadcasters. Secure messages confirmed the embargo. The statement would be released at an exact hour, synchronized with the BBC and leading networks. This coordination was no accident. The monarchy understood that in moments of uncertainty, clarity had to arrive all at once. Staggered reports risked speculation, and speculation risked disorder. Inside the palace, William and Catherine reviewed the statement privately before it was sent. William's face was set, betraying little of the storm within, while Catherine read with a quiet intensity that suggested she was weighing the effect on every household in the country. Their approval was not ceremonial. It was essential. The words being released would define how their future roles were perceived before they themselves had spoken. By 7, the first camera crews had begun to cluster at the gates of Buckingham Palace, unaware of the full gravity of what was about to break, but sensing significance in the heightened activity of staff. The flag above the palace still flew, but the atmosphere among the press corps was taut, sharpened by instinct. The statement reached the public at precisely 8. Newsreaders, their voices calm but edged with solemn weight, shared the update. The king's condition, the family's presence at his side, and the reassurance of uninterrupted governance, all were delivered within minutes. Newspapers followed with digital headlines that swept across screens in households from Cornwall to the Highlands. For ordinary citizens, the morning became unforgettable. Commuters on trains leaned toward one another to share phones displaying breaking news. Shopkeepers paused mid-task to turn up radios. In schools, teachers chose carefully how to explain the shift to children too young to fully grasp it. The effect was both national and deeply personal, uniting households in a shared moment of reckoning. Yet the statement was deliberately restrained. It did not dwell on detail, nor did it invite public pity. Instead, it closed with a single promise. The work of the crown would continue, guided by steadiness, duty, and care for the nation. Behind that line lay hours of debate, but in its brevity it offered what the people most needed: assurance. What gesture would mark the new reign's first step into the public eye once words had been spoken? Stay with us to know. A new promise from the balcony. The palace balcony has long served as a bridge between monarchs and their people. It is the place where history is distilled into an image, where the faces of rulers are revealed not only to the crowds below, but to the wider world watching from afar. On this morning, the doors to that balcony opened not for ceremony or celebration, but for reassurance. William and Catherine emerged side by side, their steps measured, their expressions composed. They wore no crowns, no robes, and yet the symbolism of their appearance was unmistakable. In the soft daylight, they represented both continuity and change, carrying the weight of expectation with a calmness that steadied the moment. The crowd gathered outside had swelled since the morning announcement. Thousands stood in silence, many clutching flags, some holding flowers, others simply staring upward with a quiet reverence. The stillness was striking. There were no cheers, no bursts of festivity, only a collective breath held as the couple appeared above them. William's gaze swept the scene below. He saw not only a sea of faces, but also the depth of responsibility pressing against him. The memory of his father's private words lingered, framing every gesture he now made. Catherine, standing close, embodied a quiet strength that seemed to balance his resolve. Though still in treatment, her presence by his side spoke louder than any address. It was an unspoken message: unity in the face of transition. When William raised his hand, it was not the wave of triumph but of steady acknowledgement. He was not yet delivering proclamations or grand declarations. Instead, he allowed the act itself, his presence on the balcony, alongside Catherine, to carry the meaning. The people were not left without a figure to look to. The crown had not vanished into uncertainty. It was already taking shape in their steadiness. Catherine leaned slightly toward him, the gesture subtle but powerful, a reminder of partnership. For the watching nation, it was a glimpse of how they intended to rule, together, as equals in duty, balancing public life with the private strength of family. Outro. What shocked you most? The quiet farewell of Charles, the sudden crowning of William and Catherine, or the secrecy around it all? Share your thoughts below.